Welcome back to Verbal Sparring. In today's video, we are going to be taking a look back at the UFC 2025 calendar on a month-by-month basis. And if you're new to the channel, you may not know that there is a monthly episodic series where we look at each card in depth, how many fights took place in each division, how many knockouts, how many submissions, how many decisions, how the rankings were directly impacted in the aftermath of which card, which debutants got victories in their first UFC fights, and everything else in between. And so with that monthly series here on the channel that you can check out, I will link below, I have a running tally of each month in the UFC, and of course I took all 12 of the months, January through December, and made them total for the entire year of the UFC. So we are going to take a look back at January all the way through December, and to cap off the episode, we are going to look at the big picture. How many fights total were there in the UFC? How many knockouts? How many submissions? What was the finishing rate? How many men's fights? How many women's fights? Any statistic that you can think of from a fight-by-fight perspective, I have broken down here in this video. So let's go back all the way to January of 2025 and run through UFC by the numbers. The first event of the year was UFC Vegas 101, a fight night in the warehouse in the desert, the UFC Apex, and it was headlined by Mackenzie Dern and Amanda Ribas, a rematch over 5 years in the making. And the second card in January was UFC 311, Islam Makhachev versus Renato Moicano on 1 day's notice after Arman Tsarukyan had to pull out from the bout, and that was in Inglewood, California at the Intuit Dome. These two fight cards would have 27 fights in total with 10 knockouts, 5 submissions, and 12 decisions. There were 9 combined stoppages in round 1, 2 in round 2, and 4 in round 3, and 11 of the 12 decisions were unanimous. Middleweight was the division with the most amount of action with 5, and that's not going to be the only time that you see that trend throughout the year, and there were 4 divisions with only 1 fight in the month, but to be fair, there were only 2 cards, so it kind of makes sense. That was heavyweight, featherweight, women's bantamweight, and women's flyweight. In February, things started to kick off as we would see 4 fight cards, with the first being in Saudi Arabia, and it would be headlined by Israel Adesanya and Nassourdine Imavov in the middleweight division. Then the UFC would travel to Australia for UFC 312, Dricus du Plessis versus Sean Strickland 2 for the middleweight championship. A quick trip to the desert for UFC Vegas 102, Jared Cannonier versus Gregory Rodriguez at the Apex. And the month would be capped out by an event in Seattle, Washington, headlined by Henry Cejudo and Song Yadong at the Climate Pledge Arena. These 4 fight cards would total 47 bouts with 16 knockouts, 5 submissions, 25 decisions, and 1 draw, bringing the finishing rate to the month to a measly 44.7%. There were 13 first-round stoppages, 6 in round 2, 1 in round 3, and 1 in round 4. 20 of the 25 decisions were unanimous, and we saw 1 technical decision. That was the Henry Cejudo and Song Yadong main event in Seattle, and the lone draw of the month was a majority. For the second consecutive month, the middleweight division came in with the most amount of action, this time 9 fights, and there were 2 weight classes tied with just 1 fight apiece, and that was flyweight and women's bantamweight. Then we head to the month of March, and it was the most action-packed month of the entire year for the UFC, as there were 5 fight cards and 58 total bouts. First was UFC Vegas 103, headlined by Manel Kape and Asu Almabayev at the Apex in Vegas. Then we had a pay-per-view in Vegas at the T-Mobile Arena, UFC 313, headlined by Alex Pereira and Magomed Ankalaev for the light heavyweight title. Back to the Apex, so 3 straight weeks in Vegas, and 2 of the 3 at the warehouse, and that was Marvin Vettori versus Roman Dolidze Part 2. Then the UFC went international for the following 2 events. First was UFC London, Leon Edwards versus Sean Brady, and then UFC Mexico, headlined by Brandon Moreno and Steve Erceg. Of the 58 fights, there were 15 knockouts and 11 submissions with 32 decisions, so for the second consecutive month, less than a 50% finish rate, 44.8 to be exact. There were 15 first-round stoppages, 8 second-round stoppages, 2 in the 3rd round, and another 4th-round finish. This time it was Sean Brady submitting Leon Edwards in the main event of UFC London. 24 of the 32 decisions were unanimous, with 8 via split. And for March, the lightweight division came in with double-digit bouts, sitting at 11, the most action of any weight class in the UFC. And once again, the women's bantamweight division comes in at the bottom with just 1 fight. In April, we saw 3 fight cards, UFC Vegas 105, another Apex Fight Night card headlined by Josh Emmett and Lerone Murphy. Then we had UFC 314 in Miami, headlined by Alexander Volkanovski and Diego Lopez for the vacant featherweight title, where Volkanovski would reclaim his throne. And then we would have a fight night in Kansas City, Missouri, headlined by Ian Machado Gary and short notice opponent Carlos Prades. There were 39 fights in total with 15 knockouts, 4 submissions, and 20 decisions, so 3 consecutive months with a less than 50% finish rate. This time in March, it was 48.7. There were 9 first-round finishes, 8 in round 2 and 2 in round 3, and 17 of the 20 decisions were unanimously agreed upon by the judges. It was the featherweight division this time coming in with the most amount of action, and for the second consecutive month, the division with the most fights came in with double-digit bouts. The featherweight division had 10 fights, and 2 divisions tied for the least amount of action, 1 apiece at heavyweight and women's flyweight. In May, we would see 4 fight cards starting out at UFC Des Moines in Iowa, headlined by Corey Sandhagen and Davison Figueiredo at the Wells Fargo Arena. Then we moved to Canada, Montreal, Quebec to be exact, where Bilal Muhammad and Jack Della Maddalena would main event for the welterweight title, co-main evented by Valentina Shevchenko and Manon Fiorot, UFC 315. Then the month would finish with back-to-back fight cards at the Apex, UFC Vegas 106, headlined by Gilbert Burns and Michael Morales, and then Aaron Blanchfield versus Macy Barber, but that fight never even happened because Macy Barber had to be pulled from the bout literally minutes before she made the walk to the cage. There were 44 fights with 12 knockouts, 9 submissions, and 23 decisions, once again falling under the halfway mark of the finishing rate, 47.7%, with 11 first-round stoppages, 9 in round 2 and 1 in round 3, and 22 out of 23 decisions were unanimous. The lightweight division came in with 8 fights, the most amount of action of any division, and there were 2 weight classes tied for the least amount, 1 fight each at heavyweight, and, I'm not stuttering when I say this, women's featherweight. Yes, the division still exists when the UFC needs it to. In June, there were 4 additional fight cards. UFC 316, the first of 2 pay-per-views in the month of June. This one would go down at the Prudential Center in Newark, New Jersey, headlined by Merab Dvalishvili and Sean O'Malley 2, and also featured Kayla Harrison versus Juliana Pena. The UFC returned to Atlanta, Georgia for a big-time fight in the welterweight division by former champion Kamaru Usman and top 10-ranked Joaquin Buckley. Then the UFC would travel to Baku, Azerbaijan for the first fight ever in this country, and it would be headlined by Jamal Hill and Khalil Roundtree Jr. And the second pay-per-view of the month was the International Fight Week card for the UFC, UFC 317, headlined by Ilia Topuria and Charles Oliveira, the vacant lightweight title fight where we would see Ilia Topuria become a 2-weight world champion. There were 49 fights in the month of June with 10 knockouts, 7 submissions, 31 decisions, and 1 no contest. This was the lowest finishing rate of any month of 2025, coming in at just 34.7%. There were 8 first-round stoppages, 5 second-round stoppages, and 4 in round 3. 29 of the 31 decisions were unanimous, and we had another technical decision, and the no contest was due to an illegal upkick. The lightweight division once again came in with the most amount of fights, and it was 8 once more, and the division with the least amount of fights was the strawweight division, and they had a whopping 0, the first time that had happened in the year so far. Kicking off the second half of the year, in the month of July, we saw the UFC head back to Nashville, where Derek Lewis would take on Taosin Teixeira at the Bridgestone Arena. Then we would have UFC 318 in New Orleans, Louisiana at the Smoothie Center for Dustin Poirier versus Max Holloway 3, the trilogy bout, and what would also be the retirement fight of Poirier. And then the UFC would head to Abu Dhabi in a fight night headlined by Robert Whittaker and Ranier de Ritter at the Etihad Arena. There were 38 fights with 11 knockouts, 7 submissions, and 20 decisions for a 47.4% finish rate, with 11 first-round stoppages, 4 second-round stoppages, and 3 in round 3, and 16 of the 20 decisions were unanimous. The welterweight division would have the most amount of action with 7 fights, and the women's bantamweight division, following suit of the strawweight division the month prior, would come in with 0 action. In August, we would see 4 fight cards, with the first 2 happening back-to-back at the Apex, UFC Vegas 108, headlined by Tatsuro Taira and short-notice opponent Hyung Sung Park. And then for UFC Vegas 109, we saw Roman Dolidze take on Anthony Fluffy Hernandez. Then the UFC would head back to Chicago for the first time in a very long time, one of the locations in the domestic United States that had a lot of fans clamoring for a return to that city, and it would be headlined by Dricus du Plessis and Khamzat Chimaev for the middleweight title. Then the UFC would head to China in Shanghai as Johnny Walker would take on the country's own Zhang Mingyang in the main event. There were 48 bouts with 16 knockouts, 7 submissions, and 25 decisions, a 47.9% finish rate, with 14 first-round stoppages, 8 in round 2, and 1 in round 4, and that was Anthony Hernandez finishing Roman Dolidze in the main event of their UFC Vegas 109 clash. The middleweight division would have the most amount amount of action with 9 fights, and the heavyweight division once again coming in at the low end with just 1 bout. In September, the UFC would have 3 events. First was in Paris, headlined by Nassourdine Imavov and Caio Borralho in a big-time #1 contender fight at middleweight. Then the UFC would have their now annual fight card celebrating Mexican Independence Day, Noche UFC in San Antonio, Texas, headlined by Diego Lopez and Jean Silva. And then the UFC would head all the way across the pond to UFC Perth, Western Australia in a main event headlined by Carlos Alberg and Dominic Reyes. There were 39 bouts with 18 knockouts, 6 submissions, 14 decisions, and 1 no contest. And for the first time since January, there was above a 50% finish rate, and this time a whopping 61.5%. Of the 24 finishes, 13 of them would happen in round 1, 5 in round 2, and 6 in round 3. 12 of the 14 decisions were unanimous, and the no contest this time was due to a groin kick. The lightweight division would have the most fights with 8, and the women's flyweight division would have 0, the 3rd time that we've seen this happen so far in the first 9 months of 2025. In October, we would see 4 events, starting off with a pay-per-view UFC 320 headlined by the rematch between Magomed Ankalaev and Alex Pereira at the T-Mobile Arena in Vegas. Then we would head to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, with Charles Oliveira main eventing against Mateusz Gamrot in the lightweight division. Back to Canada for the UFC, this time in Vancouver, as Renier de Ridder would take on Brendan Allen in the main event. And then a second pay-per-view for the second month, and that was UFC 321 in Abu Dhabi, headlined by Tom Aspinall and Cyril Gane, and so you guessed it, there's a no contest coming up. There were 52 fights on these 4 cards with 17 knockouts, 12 submissions, 22 decisions, and 1 no contest for a 55.8% finish rate. There were 14 first-round stoppages, 7 second-round stoppages, 7 in the 3rd, and 1 in round 4. We also saw a majority decision alongside 4 split decisions and 17 unanimous, and that no contest was due to an eye poke in that Tom Aspinall Cyril Gane heavyweight title fight. For the first time, we see the men's bantamweight division coming in with the most amount of fights, and they had 9 bouts during October, and the women's flyweight division came in with the least fights with 2. For November, the second to last month of 2025, there were 4 fight cards with back-to-back fights at the Apex kicking off the month. Steve Garcia versus David Onama at UFC Vegas 110, and then at UFC Vegas 111, we saw Gabriel Bonfim take on Randy Brown. Then the UFC made its trip to New York City, New York at Madison Square Garden, its yearly tradition dating back to 2016, and it would be headlined by 2 massive super fights, Jack Della Maddalena versus Islam Makhachev for the welterweight title, and Valentina Shevchenko versus Zhang Weili for the flyweight title. And then the UFC would make history once more in 2025 by making its first trip to Qatar in a main event that would feature Arman Tsarukyan versus Dan Hooker in Doha. There were 53 fights in the month of November with 17 knockouts, 15 submissions, and 21 decisions, and the second highest finishing rate so far, 60.3%. There were 15 first-round stoppages, 11 second-round stoppages, and 6 third-round stoppages, and 19 of the 21 decisions were unanimous. The welterweight division would hold 11 fights in the month of November, the 3rd time we've seen double-digit action from a UFC weight class, and we had 2 weight classes tied for the least amount of fights, and it was women's bantamweight and women's flyweight with 2 apiece. And last but not least, we head to December, the second month that featured just 2 fight cards, and it was UFC 323, the final pay-per-view not only of the year, but potentially of all time, and for sure, the next 7 years, and UFC Vegas 112. UFC 323 was headlined by Merab Dvalishvili and Petr Yan 2, and the fight night was headlined by Brandon Royval and Manel Kape. There were 26 fights in December with 12 knockouts, 3 submissions, 9 decisions, and 2 draws. There was a 57.8% finish rate with 10 first-round stoppages, 4 in the second and 1 in the third. 8 of the 9 decisions were unanimous, and for the draws, there was 1 unanimous and 1 majority. The lightweight division would have the most fights with 5. I believe that was the division where all in all, month by month, they had the most amount of months won, if you want to make it a competition, and the strawweight division would have 0 fights. And so now we have to tally up all of those numbers and bring them together for the final total for 2025 for the UFC that would feature 42 fight cards with 29 fight nights and 13 pay-per-views. And in those 42 cards, we would see 520 fights. There were 169 knockouts, 91 submissions, 254 decisions, 3 draws, and 3 no contests. And believe it or not, there was a perfect 50.0% finishing rate with 260 finishes and 260 fights that either went the distance, went to a draw, or ended via no contest. Of the 169 knockouts, 100 of them would happen in round 1, 42 of them in round 2, 25 in round 3, and 2 in round 4. No round 5 stoppages at all this year, including knockouts. For the 91 submissions, there were 42 in round 1, 35 in round 2, 12 in round 3, and 2 in round 4. Of the 254 decisions, 216 of them were unanimous, 35 saw the judges differ via split, 1 majority, and 2 technical decisions. For the 3 draws, there was 1 unanimous and 2 majority, and for the 3 no contests, there were 3 different instances. 1 was an illegal upkick, 1 was a groin kick, and 1 was an eye poke. And believe it or not, it wasn't the lightweight division that would have the total amount of most fights. It was actually the middleweight division, beating them out by 3, 75 fights at 185 pounds this year. Lightweight came in at number 2 with 72, featherweight had 61, and welterweight had 60. There were 58 fights in the bantamweight division, 40 fights at light heavyweight, and 36 at heavyweight. And we can't forget about the little guys, 41 fights for the 125ers. And for the women, there were 20 fights at bantamweight, 24 at women's flyweight, and 33 at strawweight. In the women's bantamweight division, as many of you probably anticipated, had the least amount of fights, regardless of weight class and regardless of gender, in all of the UFC. And here's some extra stats just for fun. With 520 fights over the course of 42 events, there was an average of 12.4 fights per card with 4.02 knockouts, 2.2 submissions, and 6.05 decisions. Of the 520 bouts, 443 of them were held in the men's weight classes, totaling 85.2% of the bouts, with just 77 women's fights, or 14.8% of the action. 65% of the stoppages came by way of knockout, 35% came by way of submission. Of the 260 finishes that we saw, 142 of them would happen in the opening round, 54.6%. And there were only 4 championship round finishes of all 5-round bouts in 2025, and all of them happened in round 4. Brennan Allen would finish Ranier de Ridder at UFC Vancouver, Anthony Hernandez would finish Roman Dolidze at UFC Vegas 109, Sean Brady would submit Leon Edwards at UFC London, and Jared Cannonier would knock out Gregory Rodriguez back in February. So that is it. UFC by the numbers, all things 2025 on a month-by-month basis and a grand total at the end. And I want to get all of your thoughts on this year's UFC action down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new, because we are inching closer and closer by the day to that milestone of 1,000, and any and all support would be greatly appreciated. You can also join the community on social media at Verbal Spar MMA on X, Instagram, and TikTok, as well as like the Facebook page Verbal Sparring MMA, and you can follow along on your favorite audio listening platforms such as Spotify and Apple, where every Monday and Friday during peak fight season, podcast episodes release there. Have a great week, and I will see you all in the next video.